Okay. Good afternoon. I hope everybody stretched their legs and got something to drink. So if this morning we had measures of time, and then we just had histories of time, our last panel is on landscapes of time. Now, I had prepared a set of kind of opening reflections, but actually after we finished measures of time, I was going up the stairs to grab lunch, and a person who will remain anonymous spoke to me and said, "I saw you're doing the landscapes of time." And I said, "Yes." And they're like, "Isn't that kind of redundant? All landscapes have time, don't they?" And I said, "You mean kind of like if someone orders a cafe latte with milk? Like it's kind of, saying milk twice?" And they were like, "Yeah, kind of." And I was like, "Well, no, not quite, because in many ways, the work that we're going to see today is effectively about both kind of how people interpret those landscapes, what constitutes them, maybe the shapes of them, but also the ways in which their scales and sense of time is also being kind of positioned as a subjective undertaking." This person kind of scratched their head a little bit. And then I said, "Well, have you ever seen the movie Tootsie?" The 1982 movie by Sidney Pollack. And they're like, "Sure." They're a little bit older than me. So for those of you that are younger, let me just say it's a movie about Dustin Hoffman as an actor that nobody wants to work with because he's so difficult. So he has to dress in drag to get work in New York City. And the thing was that in the United States, that's what people saw for the most part. Dustin Hoffman with a helmet of hair as a wig and so much foundation that it made Jessica Lange aghast in the movie. But in the Soviet Union, when it was watched, people couldn't believe the amount of food that was being consumed, that people had such large spaces that they lived in. So while both movies, or the movie was effectively the same, the context in when it was shown, the fragments that people put together to make the narrative of it was extremely different. And so I think today we're going to see a set of presentations that take fragments that add up to something very different. And so some of those fragments that we'll encounter range from stalactites to slow processes of deposition. They're going to raise questions about evidence. So what constitutes evidence? We'll see a range of evidence, I think, from paintings that address issues of deep time to the work of landscape architects, and also a kind of combining of geology and kind of the psyche this evening. So I'm extremely excited for what we're going to see in terms of landscapes of time, and I hope that this suffices as a kind of rejoinder for said anonymous person in the staircase. Our first presentation is going to be delivered by Kathleen John Alder. Kathleen is an associate professor and a registered landscape architect with over 20 years of professional experience, an associate professor at Rutgers University. She holds degrees from Oberlin and Rutgers, as well as an MS degree in botany from Penn State University and an MED in history and theory from here at Yale School of Architecture. As an associate partner for Olin Partnership, Kathleen was involved in landscape designs for the J.P. Getty Center, the U.S. Federal Courthouse in Boston, and the Washington Monument. She also led the firm's entry for the Orange County Great Park Competition and worked with the World Monument Fund to prepare a landscape master plan for gardens in Beijing, China. Kathleen's research involves the transformative role of ecology and environmentalism in the discourse of mid-20th century landscape design. So it's quite fitting that this is the next presentation after our previous panel's discussion. To date, this work has concentrated on the process theories of landscape architects Ian McHarg and Lawrence Halprin, and I believe we'll hear about Lawrence Halprin's work this evening or afternoon. So please welcome Kathleen to the stage.
Just want to make sure I have everything correct. Yes. Well, I want to thank Eva and Anthony for inviting me here. It's been many years since I was here at Yale, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be standing here on this side of the podium. I'm going to just jump in. I think I'm around 25 minutes. It might be a little bit later, and it's really kind of thrilling. I'm going to talk about a certain type of tree, but to follow Sylvia in her talk. So to begin, the RSVP cycles, creative processes in the human environment, written by landscape architect Lawrence Halprin in 1969, intertwines design and time in multiple ways. Halprin's thoughts on these interactions embrace deep time, material agency, and other than human processes that today may seem familiar, but in the 1960s required further examination. Given the many kinds of time that shaped his thoughts, this talk is limited to Halprin's investigations of geology, ecology, and physiology. In terms of geologic time, it references the landscape morphology and slow processes of deposition and erosion. With respect to ecologic time, it considers the more immediate impacts of humans upon the land's natural morphology. And with regard to physiologic time, it explores a design strategy that incorporates the body's imperative for a rapid equilibration between internal and external conditions. The Sea Ranch, which Halprin helped plant and where he also lived, this home is a sketch, or this drawing is a sketch from where he lived. It serves as the case study. So I'm going to begin a little bit with giving you the background for the project and then going into the people that influenced Halprin as he formulated his design strategy for the Sea Ranch. So the Sea Ranch design saga began with architect Alfred Boeke, a financially savvy idealist who dreamed of creating the best planned community in the United States. In 1959, Oceanic Properties hired Boeke to oversee their operations. Flush with cash following the purchase of the Dole Company of Hawaii, Oceanic sought to position itself as a major real estate developer. Sites were set on California, and Boeke began his search for a venue that would fulfill his dream. Boeke's first glimpse of Rancho Del Mar, the 5,000-acre sheep ranch which would become the Sea Ranch, occurred several years later during an aerial reconnaissance of potential development parcels. Quickly grasping the unique qualities of the rugged coastline, windswept meadows, and forested hills, he decided to purchase the property. He spent a week walking the land and cataloging its attributes for the sales pitch that ultimately convinced the company president to support the project. Whatever was built would remain a hard sell when compared to new developments in the more amenable climates of Carmel, Monterey, and Big Sur. The remote location, 120 miles north of San Francisco, which according to one of the original team members was 3 hours by car or 2 hours by Porsche, presented another obstacle. Yet Boeke remained convinced the site could become an economically viable and physically comfortable second home community. Now, Boeke selected Halprin to oversee the planning effort. He was familiar with Halprin's work through an oceanic project in Hawaii, and Halprin was familiar with Rancho Del Mar as he and his family often camped south of the site at Fort Ross. Project directives issued in July of 1963 included an overall evaluation of the landscape, a site plan, and a schematic design for 1,000 acres, plans for 5 models homes, and to distinguish this project from its suburbanized competition, buildings clustered around common land, and the discrete accommodation of cars. The suitability of the site for development was the major concern, and the schedule was tight. Boeke outlined a 2-month planning effort and a 5-year build-out scheme that commenced in the more scenic yet environmentally sensitive southern area of the site first. This approach necessitated a low density that conveniently reduced the initial cost and exploited the marketing potential of the coastal setting. Density would increase along with financial obligations as the work moved north. The Sea Ranch, Boeke observed, would, quote, adapt itself to time and change in the market and change in need, unquote. From the beginning, Halprin considered the project to be an innovative experiment in landscape design. To help with this endeavor, he recruited Richard Reynolds, a graduate of Berkeley's Department of Geography, who was trained in field observation, the reading of extant plant communities as indices of human occupancy, and the role of fire in Native American land management. Reynolds spent 2 weeks at Rancho del Mar surveying the land and recording his thoughts onto tapes that were later transcribed. He measured wind speed and deflection. He documented how the cypress hedgerows blocked wind and created a microclimate that fostered the growth of succulent plants, which in turn attracted sheep. And he registered how these patterns made him feel. Steady wind was, quote, irritating if one sat out in it for some time, while a gentle curling eddy leeward of the hedgerow was somewhat of a relief. This was a dynamic, often unruly, almost chaotic landscape in constant motion. Not even the hedgerows were static. Branches bending and touching the ground in response to the wind grew adventitiously, causing the trees to move over time. Reynolds interspersed this biophysical observations with ethnographic commentary. His discussion of plant communities, for example, portrayed indigenous land use as the beginning of actions that led from hunting and gathering to lumbering and sheep ranching. In this chronology, cycles of burning established a grassland habitat. The cessation of burning allowed the colonization of Bishop Pine. The logging of trees to build San Francisco provided land for farming and sheep grazing. The crops required shelter from the wind, hence the hedgerows, but the sheep overgrazed the land, creating eroded areas in need of remediation. The documentation by Reynolds reflected protocols detailed by his teacher, the cultural geographer Carl Sauer, in the morphology of the landscape. In this essay, geography is a descriptive study of the Earth's physical processes, the life forms subject to those processes, and the chronology of change resulting from their interactions. Geographers catalog these things to learn how they shaped landscape morphologies with distinct associations of natural and cultural characteristics. To enable comparative study, Sauer divided natural characteristics into geology, climate, land, sea and coast, and vegetation, and cultural characteristics into population, housing, production, and communication. His observation indicated these factors operated in parallel, but at different temporal scales. Climate and geology governed natural factors, which he said resulted in a slow and progressive change. Changes driven by people positioning themselves within the landscape were expeditious and cyclical. His intent was an impartial and verifiable protocol that mapped the linear and cyclical processes he described as interrelated phenomena acting in concert across space and time. Influenced by Oswald Spengler's theories of the rise and fall of human culture in the West, Sauer argued that settlement of the land proceeded through development stages similar to those of living organisms: birth, followed by growth and stability, and eventually, once resources were exhausted, death and decay. Rejuvenation occurred when new cultures colonized the land and superimposed different uses upon the patterns of the past. Sauer found supporting evidence in the denuded hillsides and eroded soils of the Mediterranean, detailed by George Perkins Marsh in Man and Nature, or Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action. In this material expression of time and change, natural systems provide the creative matrix that successive cultures use and exploit. Sauer's influence is evident in Reynolds' reading of the topography, soil, and vegetation inventories as indices of a land use chronology, which began, as already noted, with the impact of Native American fires before proceeding into a less benign causal sequence that linked logging to deforestation, sheep ranching to overgrazing, erosion, and ultimately soil depletion. More critically for Halpern, Reynolds entwined the logic of design with natural processes, and his cultural commentary inserted history into that logic, making the approach, as Reynolds argued, an exercise in risk management. You can learn the history of the land, and I quote, this is a quote from Reynolds, "You can learn the history of the land. The knowledge can tell you what processes are at work, both constructive and destructive. From these, you can learn how to use the land, how to plan a development, where to locate buildings, roads, and plantings. You do not necessarily have to conform to the processes at work, but at least if you choose to go against them, you are in a better position to estimate the consequences and cost." In August, Halpern's office created wind flow diagrams, solar radiation charts, and a seasonal climate matrix defined by the male wardrobe. These analyses detailed a cool, moist climate with little variation in temperature. Although less foggy and rainy than much of the Northern California coast, the wind was often extreme. To produce these drawings, the office followed protocols detailed in Design with Climate, a bioclimatic approach to architectural regionalism by architect Victor Olgay. This text begins with the proposition that people and their shelters are physiologically coupled to natural energy flows, and it provides instruction on how to manipulate these flows to improve human comfort. Olgay drew insight from scientific studies that indicated climates that required the body to expend less energy to maintain a constant internal temperature, physiological homeostasis, were less stressful and therefore more amenable to human comfort. Using the circulatory system as a model, he sought to design environments as carefully regulated and perfectly balanced as the human body. To visualize this organism, he created a bioclimatic chart that cross-referenced solar radiation, air temperature, wind flow, relative humidity, human metabolism, and sensory experience. Sunstroke and frostbite denoted the upper and lower limits of physiological tolerance, and hence the upper and lower limits of quantification, and the desired climate zone was halfway between these extremes. Essentially a systems diagram, the chart documented the energy and material flows that cycle back and forth between the body, the environment, the body, and built form. Conceptually, it allowed Olgay to calculate energetically optimal design strategies. When the data for Rancho Del Mar were graphed onto a bioclimatic chart, it was not surprisingly outside the comfort zone. In response and following Olgay, the design team manipulated the topography, vegetation, and building placement to maximize the extent of the hedgerow wind shadow, and thus minimizing the need for a wool suit and overcoat. Fence studies applied these explorations to the scale of the human body. And this approach fortuitously addressed the directive for communal open space and the discrete accommodation of cars. Houses and driveways hidden behind wind-deflecting berms and hedgerows ensured views of the ocean and the setting sun. Wind-deflecting fences provided extra protection and ensured privacy. Grassland meadows enriched the soil, and prescribed burning regenerated the forest. The demonstration homes by architect Joseph Eschrich, following the same principles, likewise exploited the hedgerows. The resulting slope roof profile deflected wind, captured solar energy, and provided a comfortable outdoor sitting area. Sod roofs reinforced the natural effect. Photographs taken shortly after construction depict the new development to be a timeless response to a dynamic and somewhat unruly seacoast climate. Now, 6 years later, in the RSVP cycles, Halpern reconfigured his work on the Sea Ranch to reflect ideas then permeating the design world from cybernetics and ecology. Although he again considered change in terms of processes over time, he theorized the why, what, and how of this dynamic as a new evolutionary order defined by systems theory. Feedback loops, illustrated in a sketch by Halpern that adorned the cover of the book, formed the armature of the strategy. According to Halpern, the linkage of action and response, the defining feature of feedback loops enabled evaluation before, during, and after the creation of a design, which allowed form and correlation with thought to become the spatial manifestation of a responsive analytic operation. The circles and arrows comprising the image indicated the operation was self-regulating and predicated toward dynamic equilibrium. Scores, defined as a system of symbols, guided interactions of, quote, space, time, rhythm, sequence, people, and their activities, unquote. As such, scores signaled how to make or act at a certain moment or place, making them useful in the study of alternative scenarios. At issue was how to notate a score and, by extension, a design unencumbered by predetermined conclusions or unjustified control. To nullify this concern, Halpern turned to empirical observations, as seen in the Sea Ranch inventory, yet he complicated this stance by situating the designer in the dual roles of impartial observer and selective orchestrator. To more fully understand what Halpern sought to achieve, it is necessary to examine the way nature, as a design imaginary, weaves in and out of his essays. As a touchstone for his personal aesthetic, it was both a demonstrable process ruled by observable facts and an evolutionary phenomenon governed by kinship, unity, and the continuity of life. In the gardens of the High Sierra, for example, Halpern observed how climate, topography, and a snowmelt stream had interacted over time to shape an alpine lake into, quote, a garden of movement and static form whose outlines imply the process of change. Seeing all of design in this landscape of jumbled rocks, symbiotic lichen, flowing water, trees, and wetland meadow plants, he insisted its order, although originating from a violent acts of disturbance, was, quote, the purest expression of motion transformed into shape, unquote. Relating this prospect to personal expression, he distilled its essence into a fundamental creativity infused with notions of time, and here I quote from Halpern. Nature has many lessons for us, but to me as a designer, two are most important. The first of these is that natural order is overwhelmingly clear. I relate to it easily. My own sense of order derives from it. Order in this sense does not imply the picturesque in the way a gnarled tree silhouetted against the sky is picturesque. This order is deeper. It has to do with natural rhythms, with relationships between objects, with lightness and heaviness, gravity and the hardness of rock. Second is process. Here can be seen the way in which these gardens arise. Process and product become almost synonymous, and the sequence of events is absolutely clear. Here art is evolved, not only by accident, but also by inevitability. Here. Shortly thereafter, in the shape of erosion, Halpern again used his observations of the High Sierras to position design within the forms and rhythms of the land. Focusing on geology, he urged his readers to study the sculptural forms of rocks and worn granite cliffs to understand how tectonic processes acting over eons led to clearly defined form. Later, in Nature into Landscape into Art, he returned to childhood memories and positioned design as an atavistic response to the unbridled intensity of the natural world. Because, quote, we are biologically part of its creation, we respond to its order and interrelationships as beautiful and right, unquote. Here, Halpern was not saying nature was art, but rather nature, as the living core of all creation myths, was a dynamic entity residing within and around us that could be transformed into art. But this would only occur if designers actively engaged this landscape and negotiated a creative relationship with its formative powers. This vision, like Henry Bergson's Elan Vital or William James's Flowing Stream of Consciousness, was an all-encompassing interaction that reflected both cognitive and conscious reasoning and a non-cognitive and subconscious sense of experience. The philosopher Suzanne Langer expressed this belief more simply by noting that form, when conceived as a vital process, removes the barriers separating intellect from emotion, enabling life to be symbolized by its setting. Halpern's objective was a relatively stable community of plants, animals, and people living with, quote, the earth and its processes, unquote. And he wanted that world to be perceived as it actually exists, as a composition of forms and actions that was more complex, expressive, and consequential than any constituent part. And this is where ecology comes into play. In the RSVP cycles, Halpern repeatedly referenced the science of ecology to describe his design approach. He did so because of ecology's ability to organize multivariate data into interrelated groupings exhibiting common characteristics, what he referred to as dealing equally with things and the relationship between things. Yet for Halpern, ecology's value was less about what exists at any one moment, but instead its depictions of motion and change. Drawing parallels between plant successions, the pathways of tropical storms, tidal fluctuations, and earthquake fault lines, he demonstrated the ways ecology revealed the spatial dimensions of time. He believed this predictive ability, if properly applied, could prevent the alluvial misfortune posed in this alternative scenario for the snowmelt stream, and I quote, trees are cut down and the forest floor and its mulches are lost. When winter rains come and pour down the slopes, they gouge the hillsides. On the denuded slopes, the houses start to slide. Down in the marsh, not only has the heron long been gone and the fish spawning place is destroyed, but the floods come and inundate the valley, unquote. Halpern coined the term eco-score to denote symbol notations of environmental processes. Emulating the functional models of the ecologist Eugene Odum, eco-scores detailed the energy flows and material cycles that unite the living and non-living components of the environment and the biophysical mechanisms regulating these obligatory exchanges. Energy input was one way and entropically dissipated into heat as it moved from the sun to plants in their photosynthetic transformations up through food chains. Material exchange, in contrast, was non-dissipative, and it cycled back and forth between living and non-living things. To describe the ecological impacts of design, Halpern also borrowed the term climax, or mature succession, characterized by orderly transition, and disclimax, or halted succession, characterized by land maintained by people or their domestic animals, from Odum. As Halpern saw it, most land use scenarios, including the overgrazed, eroded soils of the Sea Ranch, favored disclimax, but he also believed in the redemptive power of design, and returned to the High Sierras and once again referenced its alluvium to affirm that vision. And again, I quote, "Lichens dissolved the rock into soil, which then washed down into the small valleys, making them a place for other plants to grow, which made it in turn possible for animals and insects and a whole range of organisms to populate the area. The plants and animals keep modifying the habitat in a series of successions, and barring a disaster such as a disease or a major climatic change, will develop into an increasingly stable form," unquote. But Halpern was also a realist. He knew it was impossible to foresee every eventuality, especially those arising from seemingly minute, inconsequential acts. Over time, things tended to veer off course, and adjustments had to be made. Ecology provided insight into the agency of non-human processes, but not a design mechanism that could alter the trajectory of a wayward score. To address that concern, he turned to Christopher Alexander and the systems logic outlined in Notes on the Synthesis of Form. In this text, design operated through object sets, path diagrams, and the variables of form, context, fitness, and equilibrium. Form referred to the world that design could shape. Context referred to other than human forces like wind. Fitness reflected a mutually beneficial negotiation between form or design and context or other than human forces. Smoothly functioning systems maintained equilibrium in response to disturbance. There were, however, moments of rupture or tipping points when a disturbance was so great it prevented the system from regaining equilibrium before confronting another's challenge. Halpern's debt to Alexander is evident in a notebook entry titled Notes on a Notation System that visualizes the well-calibrated fit of forms as a smooth sine wave. Buildings and roads inserted into this development script disrupt the oscillation, causing it to fluctuate into an increasingly erratic pattern of inevitable self-destruction. All the connections, associations, and salient moments of Halpern's feedback approach are on display in a dramatic eco-score that documents the factors that interacted over time to shape the Sea Ranch landscape. The eco-score contains 5 timelines: geology, sea climate, vegetation, animals, and human culture that interact as they spiral out from the deep past. In the beginning, geology and seacoast climate established a naturally calibrated sine wave growth. Then came human settlement. At first, as exemplified by Aboriginal cultures, humans operated within these natural parameters. Over time, as successive cultures colonized the land, resource extraction intensified, and economic imperatives triggered biophysical tipping points. The message was clear. People had to strengthen their connection to the land, not for short-term gain, but to establish a long-term ethic of care unencumbered by dollar signs. Even more intriguing, however, are the things left unsaid, and the spiral form is critical in this context. The outwardly expanding trajectory implies the possibility of something more than the continuation or reification of what is. And this allows one last analogy to be drawn between the spiral motif, human action, and causality. As noted by the philosopher and religious historian Mircea Eliade in Myths of the Eternal Return, the spiral is an archetypal symbol that posits, quote, the past as a prefiguration of the future. denoting an archaic belief in the periodic or cyclical suspension of time, but not of creation or destruction, the spiral literally suggests that no event is irreversible and no transformation is final. If we remain with this thought for a moment and juxtapose the creative potential of its archetypal repetitions and renewals against the temporal and monetary realities of design, as seen in the Sea Ranch, we're going to see it as seen in the sequence of drawings that led to the Sea Ranch eco-score. This began with sketches that established the seacoast geology of the Pacific as the baseline metric for change. These sketches and their politically astute nod to Hawaii and oceanic properties were paired with the inventory and ethnographic commentary of Reynolds and the transformation of these observations into built form and the economics of real estate. The next drawing, strikingly similar to Boke's project schedule, organized the information into parallel chronologies. The final iteration transformed these chronologies into a multidimensional spiral into a multidimensional spiral containing spatially entangled notions of time, materials, and change. The notations fold around into a recursive assemblage of actions and adjustments that repeat, but never exactly, enabling possibilities to evolve as objects, actions, and processes developed. Unexpected twists and turns, however, disrupt the flow, deny equilibrium, and give rise to generative kinetics fraught with consequence. In this scenario, there are no absolutes, only forms of observation, rules of organization, conventions of choice, relations of use, systems of causality, and questions that are more expansive than the ones designers typically address. And as already noted, Halprin saw no problem transforming this scenario into a time-dependent proposition that incorporated empirical evidence on one hand and personal preference on the other. Things did lead to other things. The trick was to minimize disturbance. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Next, we have Ivano Del Prate, who teaches here at Yale University the history of science and technology and is the DUS of HSTM. Ivano's research explores various aspects of the interaction of science, religion, and society between the Middle Ages and the early 19th century. His first book reconstructs the scientific culture of the Venetian mainland in the 18th century, focusing on social and political repercussions of local controversies on the history of the Earth and on human generation. He has since published quite a few articles on early modern embryology, scientific communication networks, and on the visual and material culture of the 18th and 19th century astronomy. More recently, Ivano's work has questioned the normal assumption that the great geological age of the Earth was only discovered at the turn of the 19th century. In various articles and in a forthcoming book, which really sounds fantastic, he argues, on the contrary, that the possibility of an extremely ancient Earth was common in medieval and Renaissance culture. And I think we're going to hear a little bit about that this afternoon. Something that I think is also quite fantastic and is almost kind of the inverse of looking at the shore and eco-score that we saw in Kathleen's presentation is that Ivano is an active amateur astronomer who says he has a soft spot for Saturn and Mars, which shouldn't come as a surprise after yesterday afternoon. And on top of that, he's the co-discoverer of several asteroids. And so in his next book, he's going to be turning his attention to other Earths in the sky and to the fascinating cultural history of extraterrestrial life. Please join me in welcoming Ivano.
Thank you, Anthony. Happen to be left-handed. All right. In 1830, the great geologist Charles Lyell, one second. Okay. In 1830, the great geologist Charles Lyell published the first volume of his landmark Principles of Geology. And in the historical introduction to this first volume, he lamented that biblical literalism had hindered for centuries the acknowledgement of the true nature of fossils and of the immense duration of the Earth's history. Some isolated precursors aside, he held that until a few decades earlier, it had been the consistent belief of the Christian world that the origin of this planet was not more remote than a few thousand years, and that since the creation, the deluge was the only catastrophe by which considerable change had been wrought on the Earth's surface. Lyell's sentence encapsulated what was already, and has remained since, the master narrative of the history of deep time in Western culture. Only in the last few years, new research has questioned this account, showing that the alleged Enlightenment discovery of geological time is in fact a myth, elaborated during the 18th century itself as a tool of political and ideological propaganda. And this operation required and resulted in the removal of the historical memory of the complexity and plurality of pre-modern approaches to Earth and human time, and this replacement with the simplistic tale that still informs our society and even our academy. In this talk, I would like to recover and share with you some aspects of this forgotten story, showing in the first place that the short chronology of Genesis coexisted with alternative or complementary views predicated on vastly longer timescales. And what's more, the notion of the Earth's antiquity did not remain the domain of a restricted cultural elite, but spread into vernacular literature and among craftsmen and artists as well. And so the rocky landscapes of many 15th century Italian paintings may have embedded this awareness, representing the Earth as a scenery of natural ruins, scarred by erosion and old age. Weathered cliffs and bare strata often merge with the remains of classical buildings, thus extending into the remotest antiquity, the Renaissance perception of time past. We have learned this morning that dust is important. And so let's talk about footprints in the dust. The linear concept of human and earth history of the Christian chronological tradition, from a recent creation to the end of the world in a not too distant future, is often cited in direct opposition to the cyclical time of Greek philosophical tradition. In fact, early fathers of the church, like Tertullian, 2nd century, already sought support for a creationist history in Platonian and even in Epicurean writings. A version of the Stoic idea in which the particular universe in which we live is embedded in cycles of destruction and regeneration proved actually appealing to Origen of Alexandria and later Christian authors. Famously, Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine for Christians, regarded the Genesis story as a metaphor used to inculcate the fundamental principle of a creator God, though he maintained that humankind appeared more recently. The founder of the Christian chronological tradition, Eusebius of Caesarea, wasn't even sure of that, as he suggested that Adam was a collective name for the whole of humankind, and there was no way to know how long our ancestors lived in Eden before the fall. As powerful and pervasive the chronological tradition was, medieval theologians and natural philosophers flirted heavily with the idea of an ancient or even beginningless Earth. And as it happens sometimes when you start flirting, they ended up marrying it. George Kubler noticed that Thomas Aquinas adopted the notion of evum as a duration with a beginning but no end. He was hardly the only one to do so, and actually many were willing to leave even the other side open, even the beginning open-ended. A famous analogy explains that, like a footprint in the dust, the creation, that is, the footprint, cannot exist without the creator, namely the foot. And this remains true, even if the foot and the footprint have been there for the whole eternity. In other words, the creation must be not an event that takes place in time, but in philosophical jargon, a relation of ontological dependence. In this sense, the world can be both created and without a beginning. And so when Richard Dale studied the medieval controversy on eternalism about 40 years ago, he found to his great surprise that a number of 12th century philosophical works assumed a cyclical universe without a temporal beginning, and also without raising, apparently, any controversy. This is only surprising, though, if one assumes that medieval culture could accept only a single kind of temporality, with the exclusion of any other. This was clearly not the case. Again, Kubler famously argued that in his time, the tissue of history only had one dimension, that of calendric time, while the history of things talks of durations that, like appearances, vary according to kind. And for Kubler, those durations need not and should not be mutually exclusive. Indeed, in pre-modern Europe, the time of the earth and that of Christian chronology coexisted in the same culture and even in the same minds as different temporalities that served different purposes and expressed often complementary truths. So just to make an example, in our epoch, the time scales of geology and, say, of younger creationism, which is still plenty around in the United States, cohabit only in the sense that they exist side by side in mutually exclusive spheres, but they are regarded as incompatible worldviews. In pre-modern Europe, however, not only the choice did not have to follow a binary logic, but there might have been no need to choose. For example, there was no compelling reason why relatively recent events of sacred and profane history could not be integrated within the much broader cycles of a timeless Earth. And nothing prevented those who believed that time and matter did have a beginning to place this event into a remote instead of a recent past. That God made the universe was the essential point of faith. The details of the when and how never were. And this remained true even after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 established that the world was created in time or together with time, therefore banning outright eternalism. But the option of a created Earth of indefinite age remained viable. And while some authors pointed to the existence of mountains as evidence for a young world, otherwise erosion would have flattened them already. Leading natural philosophers like Jean Buridan in Paris around 1350 elaborated sophisticated orogenetic models to show that new mountains could continuously replace the old ones in a self-sustaining cycle. This was supposed to loop continuously. And the reason why he did that, it was to maintain the possibility, actually the probability, of an indefinitely ancient globe. And starting from the late 13th century, an ancient Earth was embedded in the compendia and popularizations that brought vernacular readers in contact with scholarly sources and debates. And the mostly intellectually engaged among artists and craftspeople were often among those readers, and in rare cases, even among the authors. The first vernacular scientific text, to my knowledge, at least, composed as an original work rather than a version from Latin or a translation from Latin, was completed in 1282 by an artist, the Tuscan painter, mosaicist, and bell founder Restauro of Arezzo. And Restauro continuously expresses his admiration for the work of the creator, but he feels in no way constrained by the letter of Genesis, as he presents an earth of indefinite age, scourged by periodical floods, of which Noah's had only been the latest big one. There is absolutely no evidence that this and similar work were ever regarded as religiously unorthodox and their diffusion somehow restrained. This is not to say that the creation in 6 days, a few thousand years ago, was not plain common sense for most Europeans, but what I argue is that even vernacular readers could be easily exposed to notion of an ancient Earth, because these notions were largely unproblematic and were easily found in vernacular literature. Indeed, the whole of the Earth's surface appeared profoundly scarred by erosion and by the inexorable passage of time. The Persian philosopher Avicenna, a great authority in pre-modern Europe, recognized that layered rocks formed in immemorial times by the deposition of a layer every time they see it through. And there are quite a few layers here. He observed, though, that in his age, most mountains were in the grip of disintegration as the Earth approached its next renovation. The perception of a terrestrial environment as a scenery of natural ruins seems to have been commonplace, and I'm using the term ruin deliberately, because at least in Italian, in medieval and Renaissance Italian, the word for ruin, ruina, applied to both the artificial and the natural. So in a super famous vernacular poem, Dante Alighieri's Inferno, Dante's Hell, composed in the first decade of the 14th century, ruina is mostly used in a geological sense to designate a landslide, a steep cliff, an isolated peak, or a rugged trail across a rocky landscape. The poet's descent to the bottom of the universe is often interrupted by ruined cliffs and broken arches. One of them reminded Dante of a well-known geological feature in the Italian Alps, where the side of a mountain fell into the valley underneath because, says the poet, of an earthquake or the failing of support, that is, by erosion of the underlying rocks. A correct understanding of pre-modern approaches to the history of the Earth and of their societal diffusion is, in my opinion, crucial if you are to make sense of the 15th century geological landscapes that have puzzled art historians and historians of geology alike. Until the early 1400s, of course, the complex awareness of the Earth history that I have discussed finds little to no correspondence in pictorial representations. By and large, medieval painted rocks and mountains were modeled after Byzantine conventions and simple stones that showed no hint of having had a history. Around 1400, Cennino Cennini, in his Book of the Art, still advised those who wanted to acquire a good manner of depicting mountains that they should get some large stones, which should be rough and not cleaned, and portray them from nature, and applying lights and darks according as reason permits. And I mean, portray the rock from nature in the workshop, not the mountain outside. The cave and the rocks surrounding Lorenzo Monaco's 1410 Saint Jerome are neither more complex nor more differentiated than the simple stone that the saint uses to beat his chest. The masters who, in the following years, first committed to a more naturalistic representation of the mineral world, such as Filippo Lippi, Bono da Ferrara, Antonello da Messina, or Colantuono, are often associated with the diffusion in Italy of Flemish manners and their attention to the details, be they the wrinkles on a man's face or the minute pebbles and shells of a conglomerate rock. In 1439, Filippo Lippi's Saint Jerome in Penance staged dramatically the transition between the medieval mountain and the more dynamic subject. The outer mold of the crag still follows conventional canons, but then the rock split opens, revealing a composite interior with mounds of debris detached from the exposed stone, while the terraced platforms that were typical of the Byzantine tradition begin to evolve into shapes recognizable as earth layers. I cannot expand here on their further evolution into the geological landscapes that became so prominent in the works by Mantegna, Botticelli, Filippino Lippi, Francesco di Giorgio Martini, Leonardo, and many more. But I would argue that artists and patrons would have easily recognized in those towering peaks, streams cutting through the hills, layered outcrops, and exposed strata, sectional views into the bowels of a decomposing earth, as those images embedded the views of its nature and duration that had long been common. These peaks would be called a ruin. There are poems calling peaks and isolated mountains ruins, still in the 1500s. Interestingly, those landscapes of ruins and degradation are occasionally interspersed with episodes of rock formation and rock growth that in coeval literature are also described as local and temporary inversions of the general trend from Avicenna down. So in Mantegna's Parnassus, the enigmatic stone that appears right above Hephaestus's cave is the idealized representation of a calcareous rock, like those that could be found and observed to grow in hot springs. And actually it is very easily recognizable because of its white color, its tumor-like appearance, and its association with water and fountains, which matches literary descriptions. This would be the real thing. Just for the record, I'm not the one bathing there in spite of the sign. So the ruins of the earth complemented and prolonged into a more remote and less defined past the classical ruins they were often associated with, and that began to appear right in the same years. Ruins of the two kinds not only appear alongside, but they also intermingle and merge one into another, thus providing a visual counterpart to what Pamela Long called the complex and gradual collapse of the distinction between art and nature in this century. Late Quattrocento landscapes are often strewn with architectural ruins whose dislodged stones and marbles are slowly turning back into their primeval state, to the point where the natural and the human-made become undistinguishable. In Bellini's Some Fresques in Ecstasy, preserved at the Frick, the bricks behind the saint seem to grow insensibly into geometrical shapes from the amorphous rock on the left, or perhaps a man-made wall is transitioning to a less ordered state, with no clearly discernible demarcation line, again in agreement with easily available literary sources, like Albertus Magnus's Book of Minerals. In the same way, it could be difficult to determine whether a fossil fish was nature's aborted attempt to organize matter in a more complex form through spontaneous generation, or it was instead the ruin of a once living animal. And this explanation, by the way, was a mainstream doctrine, not the intuition of some genius ahead of their time like Leonardo. Conversely, it was common to use architectonic elements as architectonic elements, natural formations, or perhaps more correctly, at least in this case, but there are more, formations whose origins appear ambiguous, as they could be either man-made buildings whose stones are slowly returning to a primeval state, or natural ruins resembling artificial structures. Undone ancient architectures were endowed, of course, with religious and theological meanings, arguably symbolizing, especially in nativities, the birth of the new Christian civilization from the ruins of the classical world. I would suggest that natural ruins would have had a similar function, as they showed a decrepit earth ripe for regeneration. Donald Strange contended that the background of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, or of the Virgin of the Rocks, represent post-diluvial landscapes as they emerged after one of the many restorations of the world, perhaps coinciding, one may suggest, with the ruins of the previous one. Likewise, his deluge drawings did not refer specifically to the biblical event, as one may perhaps instinctively think, but to any of those that devastated the earth in a past that could be as remote as it remained undetermined. Perhaps counterintuitively for us, it was Christian chronology that demanded and obsessed over temporal exactness. And it was not what we could call now geology. And indeed, Leonardo was not interested in historical geological facts that belong to the past, but in the ever-present forces and processes that shape and continue to shape the Earth. He was interested in the time of the Earth, not in the time of chronology. And because of this, to the great puzzlement of some, or desperation, of some historians of geology, Leonardo never tried to determine the absolute age of the strata that he painstakingly studied. After all, as Scripture itself teaches in the book of Ecclesiastes, who will ever count the sand of the sea, the water drops in the rain, and the days of time? Thank you.
I'll invite our speakers to come up. Oh, yes, we're a slight change in the program. Not really change, but We'll have a conversation and question and answer with you two, and then our last presenters have something quite special in store for us that we'll go out on. Thank you for those really wonderful talks. I think trying to square something from the 20th century and then debates about the origins of the Earth is a fun panel to get to be the moderator of. So thank you for putting me in that position. And I suppose the question that I have has to do with some of the ways in which a chronology gets established and debates not just only over kind of chronology itself, say, I think Ivano, certainly monogenism and polygenism were certainly being debated in the time that you were speaking to, but I think about the ways in which certain processes of time, say erosion in both your cases, both form a kind of analytic, and they're used certainly for certain forms of explication of the landscape or the land and people's relationship to it, but also certainly as a kind of application as well. So I'd be curious to hear about the ways in which the people that you study use, use these processes as both analytical tools, but also presumably as projective ones as well.
Well, yes, there are quite a few instances in which this can be seen. And one study that I like to cite is Morgan Henn's study of Renaissance buildings and their attempt of making them earthquake resistant. I think it's on. Okay, make them earthquake resistant. According to the principles of Aristotelian meteorology. Meteorology at the time was the discipline that was included geology and what we call geology and earth history. And so those builders were actually actively using the natural philosophy of the time in order to build their, to make their buildings. These processes and the awareness of this cyclical earth were used by linguists in the 1500s in controversies on what language should be used even for science, if it should be Latin or if vernacular has some dignity. And that was well before, by the way, Galileo's dialogue on the great systems of the world that was famously printed in vernacular. And an argument that was made is that one should use, not fixate on Latin, but should use the language of the time, because of these great floods that will periodically sweep the earth, every civilization is coming to an end and will be swept away and has to start over. And so there will be new languages, and the ruins and documents of the past will be swept away. So one should use the language, the live language used at the time. Another thing that is especially well known and that merges this meteorology and geology with astrology and the kind of books that we saw yesterday are astrological predictions about the arrival of these deluges. The idea is that geological cycles of the Earth depend on the movement of the sky. And so, for example, astronomers could compute using the books that I've shown yesterday that in 1524 there would be a big congregation of every planet in a watery constellation, that of the constellation of Fish. That would be a big flood. The greatest possible flood, because every single planet was going to congregate there. But what kind of flood? Is it again another flood like Noah's flood? Is it just some big rain but something manageable? Is it palingenesis and a revelation on the universe? And there was this full range of forecasts and expectations that always was mixed with the beginning of the Protestant Reformation and the Great Peasant Wars, just 1 year later, 1525. Some said, oh, this is the deluge that was going to arrive. But what is fine, especially striking, is that the Bible says explicitly that God will not send another flood. No one seems to care. The main tenets of the meteorological tradition, like that there are these cyclical floods, seems to have been absolutely widespread and commonplace. There are some voices or some scholars that said, oh, we're not going to have a flood because God said that it's not going to happen, but they are absolute minorities. And so these, all of these cycles and the idea of this creation of the earth and that the civilization is swept away by natural catastrophes periodically seems to have been deeply rooted at any level of culture.
When I think about Halprin, again, you have to think about it as a continuum. There wasn't just erosion. It was the pace of that erosion, and if it occurred at a certain pace, then there was deposition. And so erosion and deposition worked in unison to create a more fertile landscape and environment. And so I think that that's all really very interesting. The other thing, you can't get into it in a 25-minute talk, but Halprin was one very religious. He spent an awful lot of time in Israel in his youth, and so he also was really, it's really crazy thinking about it. I think it's one of these things that Eva would love. It's 1960s to 70s California happenings combined with youth on the kibbutz and thinking about Hebrew theology. Then he was a botanist and he knew ecology. And so, I mean, you see all of these things coming together. But again, I feel that he didn't separate creation from destruction. They were continuum, they were mutual interaction. And as they worked at a certain type of process, which he hoped that design would help regulate, then it would be something that would be very creative.
So kind of coeval. Questions? I think I bring you the mic.
So I was curious about the hedgerow and the use of hedging at Sea Ranch and maybe in other works by Pelkonen. And I was just kind of curious. So I think you indicated that the primary reason for the use of the hedging was for windbreak. But I was just kind of curious if there were other sort of ways in which there were it was used as a productive system in terms of whether anything was produced encompassing for use on site in terms of building material, or if there were other sort of like extensive uses of that system that may be filtered into other parts of the sort of design methodology of the area.
Well, they did clear the forest and they used the wood in some of the building. But again, I think going back to what Sylvia was talking about, people relate the hedgerows to the Sea Ranch as something that's always was there. But they were built to protect truck gardening. And then when they did their empirical analysis, actually, Richard Reynolds had so much to do with that design. And Halprin would come in afterwards and do these sketches following his little sketches. But he discovered that the plants created a wind shadow that allowed succulent plants to grow. It was less dry. The soil was less eroded by the wind, and it attracted sheep. And so therefore he said that the logic of this building and this design process should be that we should shelter the homes within the hedgerows. And that's exactly what they did. So the trees become something really important, but it's also, I think, the whole tectonic of the landscape, that windswept landscape that was near the San Andreas Fault. It slopes up, so there's not only were the trees biological, but they were tectonic and of the earth as well.
I'm wondering if our presenters can address the question of hell on earth, an apocalyptic time in which we heard a keynote speech regarding politics and whether we could bring that into the worldview pictures in which American national politics has been bifurcated between MAGA, Trumpism, and then also Bidenism, which some of the religious scholars are calling the difference between evangelical worldviews and also Catholicism.
Okay. Right. So, one of the reasons I decided to write this book when I arrived in the United States is that I figured out that I should be quite useful, because if I'm right, I haven't seen any serious rebuttal so far. This idea that traditionally you have always had to believe in a recent creation 6 days ago, 6,000 years ago in 6 days in order to be a good Christian until the 1700s and the 1800s. And so young creationism and radical Christianity is simply reconnected to the traditional doctrine of the church. And this is absolutely not true historically. It's simply not true. And I think that everyone believes that in good faith. Actually, professional geologists believe the same thing, for better or worse. The same narrative, but this narrative is demonstrably false. It was never the case that you had to be a good Christian in order, a believer in the literal interpretation of Genesis in order to be a good Christian. And actually, no longer than 2 weeks ago, I was at the Renaissance Society of America talking with a reader of my book that has actually been published meanwhile, who teaches at a Protestant university. And he was asked not to teach anything that was contrary to a statement that mentioned these points. A recent creation, evolution is nothing, and so on. And he wanted to utilize my work in order to write something as an insider that could establish on better foundations a discussion on the topic. And as for the flood, I think that the flood really, it is an anthropological category. Rather than a historical one. Because the flood is something that, in different forms, that is awaited every time we find ourselves in an epoch of great anxieties and expectations of polygenetic renewal and of civilization. It has happened, for example, in the mid-1500s, when these astrological predictions actually mixed with polygenetic expectations brought by the collapse of the medieval church and the rise of the Protestant Reformation. And honestly, we are expecting the next flood ourselves, because we have a strong feeling that we are towards the end of a cycle of civilization. And as it often happens, and it happened even back then, there was the expectation, which is a bit more subdued to us, not obvious, but I think it's there, that the renovation of the earth and the renovation of human society must go together. And our language, when it comes to ecological crisis, is still imbued with religious speaking, actually, religious terminology. We no longer sin against God, or do not believe that much, at least in many, not as much as we once used to, but we can still sin against nature, and nature will send, will revenge. And we need to amend our ways, even morally. We have to consume less, we have to be more self-conscious, we have to exert less pressure on the environment, and you cannot do that if you don't change morally, and you don't become better. So I hope that at least I answered in part your question. I'm answering as an historian, and really I would not like to go into American politics. As you probably understand, I'm not even a native speaker, and I arrived in this country about 15 years ago. But the contribution I can bring is this kind of contribution. As a historian, there are certain narratives that are deeply rooted in American society and deeply controversial. I teach classes on science and religion, and students arrive from Alabama, from Texas, with their pages on evolution ripped apart from their books. And they take this class because they are looking for answers, because religion is important for them, for their background, for their family. And they have been raised in a context where they have been asked to choose. It's either science or it's either their faith. Historically, did not have to be the case in historical Christianity. And so this is a contribution that I think I can bring.
I just briefly going to add to that, but I think one of the things that when I was listening to the talk last night is the notion of environmental restoration and ecology being something that is romantic and instilled back into kind of this picturesque primordial vision of what the earth is. And if there's definitely that in it, but you can see that in the Sea Ranch design, which was one of the first ecological designs. They were using the most updated technology, record tapes, they were recording on tapes, they were using a book that was just published, they were measuring wind, etc. And so that this notion of technology and knowledge and how we understand the environment is so, you can't separate the two. And so I think that to say that this notion of going back is something that it's problematic, but it's something that's really, in the past couple of days, I've been thinking about a lot.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on for our next presentation. Please join me in thanking them. Okay. Last but not least, we have geopsyche, which will be presented in just a moment. But first, let me introduce our speakers. We have Sara Ekström, who's working with film, photography, text, and site-specific installations. Sara explores liminality, temporality, and the stratification of time and history, moving on the borderlands between the concrete and the allegorical, the past and the future. Messages scratched and burned on walls of an abandoned prison are one instance, ritual masks emerging from the depths of disappearing forests, erupting volcanoes, creating steaming passages to the underworld and our subconscious. Obviously, all of this fits quite nicely with landscapes of time. Sara has been recognized with the Finnish State Art Prize in 2023, the Finnish Media Art AVEK Award, or AVEK, in 2018, and the Southern Finland Art Prize in 2017, as well as nominations for Arts Fennica and Carnegie Art Award, among so many others. Sara will be joined also by Taru Elfing, who is a curator and writer focused on nurturing undisciplinary and site-sensitive inquiries at the intersections of ecological, feminist, and decolonial practices. As artistic director of CAA, Contemporary Art Archipelago, she leads a research residency on the island of Sami in the Baltic Sea in collaboration with the Archipelago Research Institute of Turku University. She is also a lecturer in Praxis MFA program in exhibition studies at the University of Arts, Helsinki, and a researcher in the Trans-Disciplinary Center for Sustainable Ocean Studies at Abu Academy University. Her curatorial projects range quite a bit and include everything from a research pavilion to earth rights, hours, years, and eons, frontiers and retreat, contemporary art archipelago, and towards a future present. She has published internationally in co-edited publications such as Contemporary Artist Residences and Altern Ecologies. Elfing has a PhD from Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths University of London. So please join me in welcoming them.
So thank you all for your wonderful presentations. It's really great to be here. And we are the last ingredients of Eeva-Liisa's time soup here. And it's almost by an accident that we are here because Eeva-Liisa was seeing my exhibition in Helsinki called, what was it called now? In the Still Eye of the Time Storm. So, and the exhibition consisted of photographs, sculptures, video works, which all were connected to time in one way or the other. The film that we are going to see today the geopsyche was the core of this exhibition, and I think that was one of the reasons why we are here, since Eeva-Liisa really loved both the film and Taru's text that was connected to the exhibition. The film is made during 5 years in various locations, such as the Nerja caves in Spain, dripstone caves with traces of early humans, and on Iceland, where the geothermal energies are fracturing the surface of the earth and revealing its burning core, and the islands in the Finnish archipelago polished by the Ice Age, the last Ice Age, the Vexel. So this was my short presentation, and we are not going to have a Q&A, but if you want to ask us something, we are here, and just tap us on our shoulder. And
do you want to say something about the music?
Oh yeah, sorry. The music for the film is composed by Aleksandra Switz, a very young Polish composer, and she is combining classical instruments with electronical music, and it's very hypnotical. She makes these very, very slow progresses in this music, and it was a really, really wonderful experience to collaborate with her on this. So there are 5 segments. We move from the dripstone caves, like a hypnos, like a sleep, towards chaos, the second part. Third part, we get fossils and volcanoes. Then we are near the mountains, and eventually when we end up on these beaches, polished beaches, which for me represented some sort of a cosmic love, with our small globe rotating in space, the sun sort of caressing these rocks every day from slightly different angles. And it became a ritual for me to film it daily, register this encounter with the sun and us.
Thank you. It's a really humbling experience to be here last at the end of this incredible program. And I also I kind of salute you all who are here still, and kind of focusing and following from through this program. But I also I give you permission to also listen to me in dream time if you feel that that's the right thing to do at this point of the day. So I will do a reading of a short text, an edited version of what I wrote with Sarah's work for her exhibition. Light flickers in the pool of darkness. Dripstones grow and gather gradually into sedimentations of time, like folds of skin and bones, or like clusters of mushrooms in the depths of the earth. The ground ripples, bubbles, and fumes, its surface appearing as a porous contact zone rather than a sealed boundary. The rock erupts into liquid fire. Clouds of gas drift along the barren land. Rain and ice sculpt stone gently into smooth, curvy bodies of rock. The elements interlace in the cycles of ceaselessly morphing matter. Sarah's work guides us to the sources of life, yet these origins no longer seem remote in the past, but intimately enmeshed within the here and now, even within our bodies. Emergence is reenacted time and again through various rhythms of renewal and transformation. Geological deep time is at play here in radically different yet interdependent phases of eruptions and erosions. Stability is a mirage for some and a foundation for others, depending on the perspectives grounded in distinct lived temporalities. Hierarchical distinctions between life and non-life dissolve as the life-giving power of that which has been deemed the opposite of life, the inanimate matter, gains center stage. The inert is the truth of life, not its horror, as Elizabeth Bovinelli writes. Fossils act as mediators, inviting visceral encounters across temporal and geographical distances. They are time travelers, carried by the tectonic plates and drawn from the sediments of oceanic archives to the shifting shorelines by the age-old choreography of expanding and retreating glaciers. In their uncanny appearance of lively softness, the fossilized skins of ancient life forms put us in touch with another time and place. The long-extinct life vividly persists in the present as mere impressions of skins and scales, yet their presence is anything but superficial. Fossils momentarily suspend us, as if outside of all fixed coordinates of time and space. Human bodies carry their own deep time memories as material traces of our relations to now extinct life forms that inhabited the primeval seas. The longue durée evolution replays itself in fast forward in the formation of the human body. As Sarah reminds us in her work that captures an otherwise passing phase in the development of a human fetus. Alongside casts of fossils, the atavistic muscle appears like an ancient creature itself. It haunts the present like a mythical protagonist or a material witness in an origin story where our humanity turns out to be not only mammalian but also amphibian. This muscle memory, like the salt in our bodily fluids or our lime-hardened skeletons, stands as evidence of our marine inheritance. In various stages of solidity and fluidity, we are also mineral, entangled within and dependent on the perpetual processes of materialization and dissolution happening all around and within us in a multitude of temporalities. Similarities are written into different bodies as patterns. Likenesses of forms draw out resonances across spatial scales, like enfolded landscapes of myriad embodiments, mountainous and minute, elementary and intimate. These kinships must also be coded in human minds and imaginaries, as suggested by the mandalas of dynamic figurations emerging as sound vibrates through bodies of water. Fingery eyes sense the reverberations in the silent images as the hypnotic forms trigger associations ranging from microscopic to cosmic, cellular to planetary. Moving between light and shadow, in and out of view, the films tenderly weave a sense of proximity across irreducible differences. The camera acts like a beacon, drawing into visibility phenomena which usually appear merely as part of inanimate backgrounds or as passive stages for events. Film and photographs have a spectral presence here, simultaneously ghostly and like a prism, drawing with and to light a multitude of perspectives. Light allows for the emanation of forms. It also intensifies the shadows, detaching the objects of its attention and letting them waver right at the edges of visibility. The images seem to be sculpted as if out of grains of time. A cyclical rather than linear sense of time and timelessness is woven into a haunting experience of being a witness to something already gone, yet constantly emerging, fleetingly present in the flickering images. Moments and encounters are also literally materially engraved in film. Scratching of the film with rocks reenacts the transformative movements of bodies, of earth and water or ice against each other. It is reminiscent of the constant wearing of skin and bones in the depths and on the surfaces of human bodies. Sarah works against the grain of modernity's disdain for nature as inert. In her earlier work, decomposition becomes indistinguishable from composition in eternal cycles of formation of both matter and meaning. She has thus given life back to still life, which as a European art historical genre encapsulates the transition from animism to colonial and industrial capitalism's extractive relationship with the earth and its myriad inhabitants. The vital potentiality of matter has not only been regarded as dead, but also monstrous. Why is feminine morphology, the meanings attached to the form of a female body, associated with all that erupts, spills, and mutates? Sarah's work can be seen to reclaim this curse as a gift. Not unlike Ursula Le Guin writes about mud as that which lies around being wet and heavy and oozy and generative. Here granite stands no longer as an opposite in its perceived hardness to the adaptive and impressionable viscosity of mud. In the photographs of morphing nascent forms of clay sculpted by hand, surface and depth further entwine. With gentle force, hands have molded the clay, like the glaciers have carved the rock. Curved shapes twist into labyrinthine configurations, where the smooth surface flows effortlessly between inside and outside, while softness and solidity appear as purely temporal matters. The planet will never come alive for you unless your songs and stories give life to all the beings, seen and unseen, that inhabit the living earth, Amitav Ghosh writes. The animate force and agency of the earth and its atmosphere, the geological and the meteorological, demand to be reckoned with in the face of the accelerating ecological emergency. In Saara's work, the focus on geological time does not deem human impact insignificant, merely a momentary blip in the aeons of ceaseless change, even if the human figure is absent here. Rather, deep time is intricately interwoven into human embodiment itself. Different temporalities entwine as the long durée is inscribed in the ephemerality and intensity of faster-paced existence, whether of ancient marine creatures or contemporary humans. Similarly, the work challenges the understanding of humans as a geological force, as defined by the notion of the Anthropocene in terms of monumental marks left by terraforming humans in the strata of earthly memory. Saara poses another view on the human relationship with the deep time, where the temporality of human lives, in their inter- and intradependencies with all other modes of life, appear as part of geological folding and unfolding in the cycles of birth and death, materialization and dissolution. Light seeps into the depths of the unseen. It floods through the screen and the skin of the film like a thickening cloud of matter. The image vanishes at the cusp of its emergence. An end is yet another beginning.